Welcome to Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I'm here with my co-host, Misty Winston. Today, we're joined by Mila Ghorayeb. She is a Canada-based law student and writer whose work focuses on anti-war politics, ideology, and critique of media. She recently published a piece at Passage titled "Political Antagonism Has Become Therapy for a Broken Society," a very timely piece, not just for now, but for the past and the future. So, Mila, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, let's get into this piece you recently published. What is the thesis in general of it, would you say?
Well, basically, I sort of noticed this phenomenon that like we've all been guilty and partaking in, myself included, where there's a sort of there's enclaves that are made online that are based on ideology, and they're kind of very dogmatic, and they involve, a sort of like self-exalting practice where it's a collective affirmation of each other by tearing down another identified ideological side, and that is done by simplifying what the other side believes and attempting to portray them as unsophisticated or unintelligent. And I was inspired by multiple incidences to write this. And so it's not just the internet that I've observed this on. It's also, just popular media, popular culture, and the way that politicians talk. So watching SNL, which I profoundly regret in any capacity, but when I have watched it, during the Trump presidency, I was just kind of just blown away by how like stupid it was. And I like why people I was kind of curious as to like why anyone would find it entertaining or funny. But then there's also more serious instances where politicians like Hillary Clinton would simplify the rationales of Trump supporters. But then also in Canada here, which I mentioned in the article, there was an incident where the conservative candidate, Aaron O'Toole, called the lefties on his campus like, oh, the dumbest people you'll ever meet or whatever. And that kind of disturbed me in a way, not because like I don't think campus lefties are geniuses, but because, if you're running for office, whether you're Clinton or O'Toole, what are you doing if you are really like denigrating your potential constituents? And like, have we really lost sight of what politics is for? So I was thinking like, yes, we kind of have lost sight of what it's for, and we're treating it as a therapeutic mechanism rather than, treating it as a means to ignite change. And so that was kind of like what I was trying to write about. And I also kind of I've been interested more recently in what the decline of community, such as religious community, has done for us politically, and how we've been replacing religious community with politics. So with those two in the background, I kind of wrote the piece, arguing basically that our politics are now a therapeutic mechanism, which I find not good. And
Right.
disturbing.
No. And I have a friend named Steve Poikonen who brings this up all the time, that in an ever increasingly secular society, that people are looking for an outlet for that sort of, I don't know what you would even call it, but that sort of expression of faith, I guess. And you're right. I think politics has become a lot of where that's going into, and which I think is incredibly dangerous. We've already celebritized our politicians. I call them celebriticians at this point. They're not even politicians anymore. They're brands. They don't actually write any laws. They don't read the laws that they pass. Very rarely do they ever actually get to read the laws. Lobbyists write them and then pay them to pass them or fail them, whatever it is. And so, yeah, it's this really scary thing where we've, kind of commodified politics too. It's all about merch and the tax the rich sweatshirt that costs $65 on a website, or it's to me it's really dangerous. And so I was really excited when Jesse sent me this piece, and after I read it, because this is something that I've been like in the back of my head kind of trying to figure out what all this means. And the Hillary Clinton example is a good one, because when she said that, I was shocked. I mean, I shouldn't have been, but I was. I mean, that's you're calling half of the country, or at least half of the voting population, deplorable. And you're running to run the country, including those people. And it seems like a really, really damaging and self-defeating policy to go about insulting people that you disagree with on politics if you're running to lead those people. I think that have we just given up? Have the two teams just given up, and they're just gonna like just start insulting each other and not consider that they're going to be presiding or ruling or whatever over all of the people and not just their half? It's scary.
It's interesting too, because like you said, two teams, and I think like in the US, right, there's two parties, it's a two-party system. And even there are like segments of the left in the US who say they're not Democrats, but then they still end up like going for them or telling people to vote for them. And so it really does seem like there's like two sides in the culture war. In Canada, there's like multiple parties, so it's slightly different. But I think, yeah, there are like multiple enclaves that are like self-affirming in nature. And I don't know where it's going to go. Honestly, I was also kind of inspired by Chris Hedges, who I read his book, I Don't Believe in Atheists, which was like a very, I don't even know how to put this, but it was like, it really impacted me deeply because I used to be like a new atheist. And one of the points he kind of makes is that like, what's a dangerous sort of trend in both new atheists and religious like fundamentalists is that they both have this sort of arrogance and hubris. And I was very interested in that and thinking like, okay, well, what underlies this arrogance and hubris? Is this like a crisis in self-esteem maybe? And so like, is the solution then to, like one of the things I think that could help, as silly as it sounds, is like more initiatives for like healthy living, for instance. I think like, if you find meaning in something like a team sport, or you find, if you have higher self-esteem, you're maybe less likely to want to try and denigrate the other side. But I mean, I don't know. I think also a lot of it is like economic, and a product of like a mental health crisis as well.
I think a lot of it's fear driven, at least currently. I think a lot of people are just terrified. And so they feel like if they can yell at other people online or look down on other people, it gives them a sense of control over that which they have no control over. So I think there's a little bit of that.
Yeah. And going off of that, you speak about reinforcing one's base. Can you get into that a little bit more, what you mean by that?
Yeah. So something I've noticed as well is there's a lot of political rhetoric that I've seen for like basically decades. I'm not that old, but like there's a lot of political rhetoric that I've observed that's like, been around for a very long time, and people still treat them like novel insights. And so some of it's just like, the classic like anti-communist propaganda that's like, well, who's going to pay for it, and like, stuff like that. But you see this on the left too. You see this everywhere, where people kind of repeat the same kind of stuff, and it might be either trivial or it might be something that we all know is insincere. So one of the examples that inspired the article is there was this sort of initiative, or this like thing that was making the news, like, oh, the Taliban promises to be more inclusive. And you had all these sort of conservative thinkers being like, oh, this is not satire. Like, can you believe this? And I guess to me, like, that did not really serve the function of actually critiquing the role of like inclusivity language in culture. It kind of instead was more like saying to like signaling to their own base who already is tired of this language, that's like, oh haha, like look how stupid these people are, look how stupid this language is, look how outrageous this is, we're so above it. um and I kind of see that as well on the left when they point to like, you know, stupid things the right does or whatever, and it's kind of like we already know all of this. So we're not really even making any advances, we're literally just like
Oh, that's such a good point.
yeah.
Because
Yeah.
we're talking in circles
Mhm.
constantly.
Yeah, and you term it the false assumption of sincerity in your
Mhm.
piece. Where do you think that comes from?
I think we want the people who we are opposed to actually be sincere, because it's better to conceive of our opponents as sincere and naive and stupid, rather than conceiving of them as complex and perhaps like able to wield and craft rhetoric in their own favor. It makes them seem more daunting. And I think, you know, what Missy was saying about it being fear-based, I think is partly like, it's like that partly explains it as well, is because, you know, it's more certain your enemy, your opponent, they're more predictable if they're sincere and naive, rather than if they are, you know, again, more complex. Maybe that might make them more sinister because they're able to sort of wield this. And so like that's why as well I kind of see a lot of um you know, these memes or critiques of like Democrats and whatever being like haha intersectional imperialism, and I kind of worry that people think um that they sincerely believe in this like rhetoric of like whether it's like feminism or LGBT rights. I'm worried that people think that like these are sincere, and it's not. It's like it's very clearly cynical. And once we acknowledge that it's cynical, it makes it a bit more difficult, because then it's like, okay, we're actually dealing with a sophisticated player.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, I was guilty of this with Trump. You mentioned Trump in your piece and about how it was very, people were very quick to dismiss him as just like this buffoon, which he is. I think that there's a very clear aspect of him that is just very buffoonish, but he is also, or was also the face of the empire at that time. And so what was working behind him isn't necessarily, you know, naive and stupid. They know what they're doing. They're very good at their rhetoric. The people in positions of power, this is a game. I mean, I focus on propaganda and narrative control and management all the time. It's what I focus on. And I think that anybody who goes back and looks historically, they have really fine-tuned this. It is an art form. They're very good at it. They know how to sell you an idea, and they know how to, I mean, we often discuss how people will vote against their own interests. It's worse than that. People are now thinking against their own interests, and they're convinced that they themselves came up with the ideas and the thoughts in their head, and they didn't. It's been fed to them. And it's really nefarious, and it's scary how effective it is.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, with Trump, again, like there was, I think a lot of liberals in the US really did not think he would win. And so there was a sort of coping mechanism with that, where they wanted to sort of denigrate him, you know, conceive of him as like this idiot, you know, even like there's weird stuff about like, you know, like weird homophobic stuff about him and
Yes.
Putin. And I feel like, you know, this is
Trash.
all, yeah, it's just all a cope, you know, it's just kind
Yes.
of
Well, that's
like,
Russiagate. I mean, Russiagate was all
yeah,
copes. Surely he didn't actually get elected. Vladimir Putin got him elected.
yeah.
Yeah, the
Well,
cover of the New Yorker proved that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. But it's really dangerous though. We spent like 4 years almost entirely focused on this fictional, like just completely ridiculous idea that Vladimir Putin got Donald Trump elected in the United States, and that he wasn't a real, like he was a Russian plant and a Russian stooge. And I mean, we didn't focus on any other issues at all. It was Russia,
yeah.
Russia, 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 Russia for years. And that's
Yeah, and
something.
And I think at the beginning, on the outset of that, I was a little bit dismissive of even the discourse of Russiagate, because I was just kind of like, okay, even if Russia did interfere, I really don't care. The US has interfered in everyone's elections, so whatever. But yeah, I do think that, it is actually dangerous to keep having this be reiterated, because it's just one of those claims that, it's hard to, or like it's so conspiratorial, and so it builds off of people's already like constructed Russophobia, or like, suspicion of Russia from a Cold War period, that I think it's just such an easy thing to keep pushing, and such a hard thing to push back against. Like, how do you prove the negative in that respect? It's a very
Well, and I mean, even now, years later, with most aspects of Russiagate being thoroughly debunked on multiple levels, they're still talking about it. It's still an effective talking point. They'll still bring it up on mainstream media. It's still something that, like, if you go out and just talk to like the average middle-age, like Midwest person, they probably still have some belief that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump are working together. And, but that's what I'm saying. Like the fact that we focused on it almost exclusively, at least in mainstream media for so many years, that repetition makes it real.
Yeah, and it leads to very large problems down the road. For instance, what happened with the New York Post reporting on Hunter Biden's laptop, which we now know was a CIA, corporate media, big tech censorship job. And that is a direct result of Russiagate being part of the dominant political discourse for so long. And it puts me in mind of what you also talk about in your piece, Mila, which is ideological proxies, which we come up with individually and collectively in our online political communities and our online political discourse. Can you break that down a little bit?
Yeah, and this whole ideological proxy thing is kind of why I don't think I put it in this article, but I put it in one of my Substack pieces, is why I think a lot of people on the left are having their wires crossed when they're like confronted with someone who might have like some left views, but then are also critical of the left. Like people like Glenn Greenwald, I think, really make their wires crossed because of that. So when I think of ideological proxies, it's kind of like, it's almost a way of, one of my friends jokes and he calls this metabolic efficiency, because it's just like an easy way of like conceiving of somebody, or like having building an idea or concept of someone without putting in much work into actually understanding them. So like, you might think, okay, well, if you're a left winger, you must believe this. If you are a conservative, you must believe this. There's also this whole like demand that you have to go into those boxes as well. Like, people are always like, are you a leftist, or you like this, or you that? And it's kind of like, it's because there's a need to
label.
be able to, yeah, and it's an understandable need, because it is more efficient. It is mentally more efficient. But the problem is then you always end up talking past each other, because then it's like, oh, well, you must believe this if you believe that. And so you end up creating these proxies, or ideology kind of serves as a proxy in that respect, where you're able to kind of come up with a theory of somebody without, without actually attempting to understand them. And so that's also why I was saying, like, it makes like people like Glenn Greenwald or Matt Taibbi, they make these people's wires get crossed, because they might come from, like, they might say something left sounding on one thing and then not on the other. And
Caitlin
then
Johnstone deals with this a lot too. And I think that this is a problem that anybody who attempts intellectual consistency is going to deal with, because people like you said, they like to divide themselves into their labels. Like this is my team. This is, we have like these strict guidelines and you can't step outside the guidelines or you're not welcome on the team. And that it just doesn't work that way, like realistically. And I understand that you're right. People are very comfortable in those. People like to know, but I think it's difficult because I deal with this to a much, much lesser degree than any of the people we just mentioned. But just in my own personal experience, I feel like people create this version of you in their head. And then that's who they argue with. And that's who they, have discussions with, despite the fact that that's not who I actually am. And you're right. There's no effort put in to actually figure out who it is that you're talking to, what they actually think, why they think what they think, how they've come to those ideas. And it's really difficult. And I think that the internet, as great as it can be, has really made this worse. And I think that the kind of the algorithm siphoning of us into our little echo chambers has been really damaging in that respect too. People aren't exposed very much to those that they disagree with online.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really drove this home for me was the Syria issue among the left. Like back when I still kind of viewed myself as part of the left, now I've just kind of viewed myself as a independent or whatever. But like I just remember these conflicts were literally just full of grand assumptions about what you must believe. I come from a Middle East Christian background, so I would express some, reservations about the opposition in Syria. And immediately it was like, oh, well, that must mean you love Bashar al-Assad. That must mean you love.
Why do you love dictators?
Yeah, exactly. And so
Yeah.
I was kind of like, why are you more comfortable with ascribing that rather than just simply asking me what I think about this leader, and that's the thing. Like, if you want to know what people think, you can just ask them. Like a lot of times, especially if, like, I'm not running for office, I have no reason to lie about why or how I view somebody. And I think, like that for me really hit at home. I think that was kind of my last straw on the sort of mainstream left, was that sort of that kind of thing where it was like, okay, well, you have to fall in line with this, and if you don't, we're calling you like this dictator lover or whatever. It's also something I kind of noticed in like the feminist movement, where people are like, you can't be a feminist if you like. So while I say that people simplify the other side, I think people simplify their own side as well, in the sense that they say, okay, well, if you don't buy this whole package, then you're not this. Like, you're not a feminist if you don't believe this, this, and this. And if you believe this one bad thing, we're going to excommunicate you from the church.
Yeah. I've dealt with that because I'm an Assange supporter. Oh, you can't be a feminist, you support a rapist. No, I don't. But that they're very quick to just push you, like, you are now, you can't be part of the group. And I also have on multiple occasions publicly said that I'm not a believe all victims person, a believe all women victim, because of Julian Assange, because I've seen the way that sexual assault and rape charges are used against somebody in political situations. It's not new. They did it to Shahid Buttar. What was the other guy? There was another guy that they used it against in like Virginia or something. But I mean, it's a very common weapon that's used. But you're right. In the feminist movement, you can't, like, they'll out you, like you will know, you'll be persona non grata for sure.
Yeah. And so, I mean, like, there's also this sort of willingness to simplify your own team. And like I said, I don't think that's good. I think it does come from a place of insecurity as well. But I also do think that this might just be a thing that we can't eradicate, because it's like, we want to have a group of people that we can join together with and make sense of the world with, right? And so, like, even for instance, in religious settings, like, I talk about the decline of religion a little bit, but I think that even when religion was not in decline, you kind of still had this, right? Where, like, you excommunicate people for not believing every single thing. And I don't know if that's something like that we just have to learn how to manage, because it just seems like there's a huge drive to want to be in a group with a consensus.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a human nature thing. You know, we want our tribe, you know, we want our like our people, and that makes sense. Like, I understand that. But as somebody who regularly advocates for working with people you don't agree with, and finding common cause with people you don't normally agree with, you know, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because over the past, I would say, at least since I started heavily working on the Assange case, that is really where I started to see where it is possible to have people from across the ideological spectrum coming together on an issue that they care about, and just working on that issue together. And we can have our disagreements. There are people working on the Assange stuff from literally all across the political ideological spectrum. So that's given me a little bit of hope that we can potentially move past that. But you mentioned also that there's a lot made about wokeness. But you feel like it's more just politics in general. Can you maybe elaborate on that? Because I'm also very like wokeness is wearing me out. Woke culture is
wearing us all out.
Yeah.
No, it is exhausting, and I think that that's the point. But you know, like, it is a method of, so wokeness to me seems like a method of discipline, right? And right now, like, this is why the managerial class loves it, because it's a way of, you know, exercising managerial discipline, and it's also kind of a way, like, you can keep saying no, what you're saying is not good enough, you know, like it can never end. But I think that this is just a piece of politics rather than its own standalone thing. And so, like, each political faction has their means, their mechanism of disciplining. And I think that each political faction has their own sort of kind of wokeness, so to speak, but that this left brand of wokeness is what's prevailing right now. But you know, in, say, the Bush era, the kind of wokeness, so to speak, was about, you know, things like the troops, or you know, certain things were off limits to joke about when it came to patriotism. I think patriotism can share a lot of qualities with wokeness, in the sense that, like, you know, it's kind of a perversion of a drive that could potentially be good, right? Like it could be about improving people's lives, but instead it's perverted into a sort of narcissistic exercise and managerial disciplinary exercise. But I think that, like, what people like, the idea of using virtue to bolster your power and manage other people is not really a new phenomenon. And I think Nietzsche kind of like did a great job of pointing that out when in his work, when he was like, kind of like, you know, Christianity was kind of doing this work. So it also it comes from a position of weakness, in the sense that you don't have like necessarily the might to, like, the physical or material might. But yeah, I just think that it's part of this whole phenomenon of people using politics as their sort of religion, in a sense. And wokeness is one of the things in the toolkit, rather than its own standalone thing.
And what's ironic about wokeness is that it's ostensibly meant to clarify, if you will, but it does more obscuring than anything else. So if you think about critical race theory, for instance, what does critical race theory boil down to? It's an honest historical assessment of what brought us to where we are. And instead, that gets buried under critical race theory. Critical race theory, I never thought I would see a top military general sitting before Congress talking about critical race theory. But I say this to point out that that's a huge problem with this concept of wokeness, is that while its intentions may be good, the intentions rarely pan out into anything positive or constructive. And what you get is what you detail or talk about in your piece, which is political discourse simply for the sake of sowing discord.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps you can get into that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think it's almost like a mini rally around the flag effect. So the rally around the flag, like as in, president has more support when they're at war, right? And I think, similarly, if you're going to like, what's easier, trying to understand your opponent and like sit down and have a conversation with them, and then that makes everyone on your side call you like whatever, like, on the case of the left, like you're red brown fascist, you're whatever, crypto, like all these terms that like you have to spend like 10 hours online a day to really understand. But just stuff like that. You end up like wanting to instead simplify another person, then they overreact or they might like react poorly, and then that gives you an upper hand in another respect, right? And so there seems to be more of an incentive to actually like create conflict than there is to try and understand another side. Because when you create conflict, you can rally everyone around you. They will affirm your position. It gives people a chance to feel like they're a part of something when there is a conflict. You can say, yeah, I support this person, and you can bond with other people over supporting that person, which doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Like, I mean, like you were saying about Assange, and I think it's kind of great that people are able to, come together and rally behind him. Like people like this can produce good results. But I do think a lot of the time there can be a perverted incentive, where, instead of trying to say, oh, okay, what do you mean by that? Or trying to see where someone's coming from, we instead want to immediately antagonize them. And I think, again, that can come from a place of low self-esteem. It can sometimes come from a economic incentive too, I'm sure. Like there are people who make a lot of
Yes.
money from antagonizing people as well. I mentioned Jordan Peterson in my article, like this guy is raking it in. And so, these kinds of things, there's a bunch of factors.
Yeah. And I think that Twitter, and I'm guilty of this,
Mhm.
I think we all are on
Yeah,
some
of
level, especially
course.
on social media. Social media is a very easy place. Yeah, I mean, you're behind a keyboard. A lot of these people are, they don't have they don't have their picture. It's not their real name. It's very easy for them to slip into just being an awful human being online because there's no consequences really. And
Mhm.
it is really easy to, share some dumb tweet that somebody tweeted at you, and then all your followers jump in and they're like, ah, ha, ha, that's so dumb, and it's it kind of does it I don't know, it kind of incentivizes, just because it does, like, it makes you feel like, oh, well, these people have my back, you know what I mean? And
Mhm.
I'm incredibly guilty of doing all of this.
Yeah,
It's very
me
different in
too.
real life.
Yeah.
In real life, I can have conversations with people I don't agree with. I do it all the time. I live in small town Ohio, surrounded by Trump voters. I have family members who are Trump voters. My kids' friends' parents are Trump voters. Like it's, and I am able, but online, I think it's just this, I think it honestly is just the anonymity of it. It's very easy when there's no, you're not standing in front of somebody. No, a lot of the things that people say online, they would never say in real life.
Oh, totally.
They would never say it in real
Yeah.
life. So I don't know how we deal with that. I don't know if we can deal with that in an online world, really.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me like when I was growing up, I went to a Catholic school and I was very antagonistic towards religion at the time, and that gave me a sense of meaning, because I was not getting meaning from anything. I was a teenager, right?
Right.
So but everything was in person, and I was still on very good terms with the people that I was arguing with all the time, like my teachers, and like some of them I'm still on good terms with today. Some of them I had to be like, I am so sorry for
Yeah.
my Christopher Hitchens behavior, but
Oh, Listen, I love no, like the hitch slap, the way that he was able to just annihilate an opponent in a debate, like that's admirable, but was kind of a douche canoe. And when you said you were like new atheist, like I flirted with that for a couple years. I was like flirted with that because I guess agnostic atheist because nobody's really an atheist. But yeah, like when you said new atheist, I was like, oh, I flirted with that for a little bit.
Well, it really helped me understand this kind of phenomenon because I was like, I have been there,
Yeah.
and I think, I was personally into new atheism and libertarianism at the same time.
Oof.
Really great combo. But I was like 15, 16,
Yeah.
you're at a time when your like self-esteem is not really great. You're like looking for meaning. You want to be understood by others. And so you're looking for a community. But I mean, yeah, like, and none of these drives are necessarily bad. Like, it's wholesome to want to be understood or to have a community or to be affirmed. I just think like with anything, any of these drives can become something bad or can lead to bad consequences if we, you know, get complacent.
Yeah, I think it's just figuring out a way to facilitate, healthier avenues of, expressing these things or, finding these things for yourself. Especially now, I think it's gotten so much worse since COVID hit. And because you mentioned the breakdown of community, and I think that that's something that we've been seeing in our societies for a while now. Capitalism is sure not helping. I mean, you can't usually both parents have to work in a house. And so there's, it really has been breaking down for quite some time, really significantly since the 80s for sure. But maybe we could talk a little bit more about that because I think COVID has really ramped this up with the lockdowns and all of that stuff. I think that communities are disintegrating. People don't know their neighbors. Like they couldn't even tell you the names of their neighbors anymore. I've lived here for 10 years. I have no idea who lives next to me. That's crazy.
And to add to that, there's discord, to keep that term going, with regard to having just a basic informed conversation about COVID, about the vaccines, about the vaccine mandates, about the coming passports or the passports that are already here in some iterations. So
yes, that is insane. I've expressed some like very good faith skepticism or questions, and I was shocked at the way that I was met with these sort of things. Like our show, we had Jimmy Dore and Max Blumenthal on to talk about the vaccine mandates, to talk about like ivermectin, whatever. I don't think I agreed with everything that was said in that conversation, but like I enjoyed it. I learned some things. I was happy to hear people's perspectives. I also don't know anything about medicine, so like I'm not going to try to pretend that I do. But when I look at the Twitter responses after, and you just see people freaking out, personally attacking
us, amazing.
It was just wild to me. And I think again, like people are tired of COVID and they kind of want to cope. They want to feel in the right. They feel uneasy when they're met with anything that can challenge the consensus. And that makes sense. We're in a time of pure like instability. We don't know what's going to happen next. But it is pretty crazy to me. Like I was I expect people to get mad at content that I put out sometimes, but I don't think I've seen anything like that.
There's a significant level of vitriol surrounding the vaccines and ivermectin. I have experienced the same stuff. And I'll keep telling the story. It's not possible to call me anti-vax. It's just not possible. I spent years in that fight. I'll say it again. In 2015, the anti-vaxxers literally put me on a list of people they don't like. I have a t-shirt and everything. Like, I'm not anti-vax. So the fact that you can be labeled as such, despite the fact that that has no meaning relative to my actual beliefs, is amazing. And they literally changed the definition of the word.
Yeah.
That's terrifying to me, that they can just change the definitions of words to fit their agenda. That should be a red flag for everybody, in my opinion.
Oh,
I mean, even if
totally.
you are incredibly pro-vaccine and you worship the ground that Fauci walks on, that should put a red flag up for you. That's not an okay thing. That's scary shit.
I straight up showed my card proving that I got the COVID vaccine. Like, I don't know if like that was like, for
It
me,
doesn't
I'm like,
matter.
you know
So did
what?
Jimmy.
Yeah, like I'm
I
like
did
I
too.
am. Yeah, I like I don't care. I have nothing to hide. Like, I'm whatever. I'm young. I was not impacted by it at all. Like, it was fine. You know, I was just like, whatever, I'll get it. Like, I spend a lot of time with immunocompromised people sometimes, like with family. So I was like, fine, yeah, I'll get it. And so like I literally showed people, I'm like, I got it. And people were like saying, oh, you stupid anti-vaxxer, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, well, how am I anti-vax if I literally received the vaccine?
Isn't that
Same with
amazing?
Jimmy, right?
Yeah.
And so it was pretty incredible. I was very shocked. I kind of was saying, like, I'm kind of sad that, we can't even talk about other treatments because, like,
That's what I find troubling, is that
mhm,
these people like proclaim that I'm anti-science because I'm questioning, which science, it is questioning. That's science. Science is asking questions all the time, like that you're constantly trying to disprove yourself. So it's not anti-science to ask questions. But the fact that the discourse has been so like very narrow. You can only discuss certain things. You can only discuss them in certain ways. You cannot have conversations outside the approved narrative, or you're like, I mean, there are people who are wishing death upon other humans because they have
mhm.
questions. And that's insane. The fact that they've been able to use this rhetoric just to divide even further, which I think was really the goal from the beginning, was just to use it as a division tactic. And it's been very effective. I mean, there's a whole, I'll say this, mostly online. I haven't experienced this in real life where people are running around asking if you're vaccinated and freaking out if you're not wearing a mask. In general, that doesn't happen in real life. But online, people are very, it's really disheartening to wish death upon another human because they have questions about the CDC, and people who are known liars. I mean, I empathize with that. Like, you shouldn't be trusting these governmental agencies, just I'm just going to trust everything they say. Of course not. I mean, the science throughout COVID has changed numerous times. So, I mean, it's really disheartening to see the way that this has been used to divide people even further.
Yeah.
And I think with the emergence of the so-called treatment that Merck is rolling out, it's going to get even worse. And that treatment,
it's ivermectin.
Right.
It's essentially ivermectin.
And the trials for that treatment were stopped early because supposedly the success was so profound before even finishing the trials that they decided, why go ahead? Let's just roll it out now. And it's going to be sold probably at prices that most of us can't afford. And you have to start to wonder then how much of this, with regard to COVID, and then also with regard to online platforms, social media platforms where political discourse takes place, how much of it is purposely designed to keep us divided, to keep us distracted, to keep us from pursuing concrete, meaningful political change in the material world as opposed to the digital commons.
Yeah, it's like, how convenient, right? That's how I viewed it as well. I don't know, like, to me, even if you look at things like I kind of am viewing it like the flu, like, you can get a vaccine, but like sometimes I also, like, if I get sick, I also like to take those Dayquil or Buckley's things to like mitigate my symptoms, even if I also, like, that doesn't mean I'm opposed to the flu vaccine, right? And so, I mean, just the fact that, even looking into other treatments means that like you suddenly are opposed to the vaccine in general. Like, I don't know. I'm just kind of like, are people being intellectually lazy, or are they just so scared they can't see straight?
I think a lot of it's fear. I really do. I mean, they've done a very good job at using COVID as a fear mongering discussion. Not to say that it hasn't, I'm sure that it could be scary if you're of a certain age or if you have underlying health conditions and all of that stuff. But the way that they've amped it up and the way that it's been used, they never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that they're always looking for ways to divide us. I mean, we were talking about the breakdown of community. That's the last thing the people in power want, is for us to actually form community with our neighbors. They don't want us, they want us divided. I mean, it's much easier to control a divided population than it is one that has come together. And it's really unfortunate and depressing that we keep falling for this stuff over and over and over again. And now we have like these weird propaganda puff pieces about Anthony Fauci going up on Disney Plus. It's like this is a guy who is like a nightmare of a human being. He's a terrible human being. I mean, that's not just the stuff that he's lied about throughout COVID, the AIDS epidemic. Y'all just look it up. He's a terrible human being. And now he has this like weird, I don't even know what that is, but like Disney Plus is making like this lionizing movie about Anthony Fauci. And it's very bizarre that we elevate these just tremendously awful people to positions of power and to levels of esteem that they do not deserve. It's really sad.
My co-host Alex on Pro Democracy Pod, he wrote a article about Fauci on his Substack, which I definitely recommend because I didn't really know much about him. In Canada, like we have different health officers or whatever, but it was really illuminating because it like, yeah, like this is somebody who totally was a bad person in the AIDS crisis and all of that. And it's kind of crazy to see him being, lionized now. It kind of reminds me of like the rehabilitation of like George Bush.
Yes.
But like there's just, I think also, there's a profit incentive there as well, right? Like if you are making this like gushing media story or a documentary about someone, you're going to make a lot of money, plus like the outrage you're going to facilitate is going to even make it even more profitable because more people are going to talk about it. And that's a problem with a lot of media today as well. Like it's all run on a profit incentive where
it's terrible.
Like, yeah.
We really fucked up. We really fucked up. Like the idea that we let corporations buy our journalism and media is a really stupid idea. I don't know why we ever thought that was a thing that should happen. I know that like we didn't, but you know what I mean? Like humanity in general, the fact that was allowed to happen. And I don't know how we get out of that now. It's really, really bad. The entire country is under corporate capture, government, social media, the legal system, everything is under corporate capture, and we're really screwed. Yeah, sorry to be a negative Nancy, but we're screwed.
It's to the point where Don Lemon can start his broadcasts on his show by declaring that anybody who's unvaccinated should be segregated in an apartheid-like way, not allowed to go to the supermarket, not allowed to travel.
They should be denied medical care if they have an emergency.
Medical care. He, I think, outright called them stupid, and
that's funny coming from Don Lemon. I'm just going to say that.
and that just gets to fly. And then you see that on arguably an even bigger or more significant scale with politicians like Justin Trudeau when he was running recently. One of the last public speeches he gave, there were vaccine mandate protesters outside of the speech he was giving, and you could hear them in the background protesting, and he's railing on about the need to get the vaccine and his right to protect his family and his supporters' rights to protect their families. And he basically points outside of where he's speaking, gesturing toward the protesters, and labels them as the enemy. And this is what passes for informed political discourse. And so it's not just with online communities, it's seeped out into politicians and news pundits' public communications.
Well, I think it's
Totally.
the reverse of that. Like it's seeped from politicians and news outlets into online, because that's the official narrative. That's the official discourse that you're allowed to have, is that you should definitely get vaccines. We should be mandating them. Unvaccinated people are stupid and irredeemable. And so that's what's permeating out into society. But there is, I mean, we're seeing significant pushback around the country, not so much in the United States, unfortunately, but in Canada, there's been a lot of protests. They were following Justin Trudeau around, which was amazing. He couldn't even he had to leave his own event because he wasn't wanted there. Even like Amsterdam, my friend Mark Lubers is in Amsterdam, and they've been having huge protests, massive, like 250,000 people in a tiny ass country are coming out. You know what I mean? And it's really like, I mean, we're seeing a lot in like the UK, and I have friends that go to protests every week in the UK. So, I mean, we are seeing some pushback against these mandates and stuff like that, which is, I mean, hopefully that's going to be enough, because I don't care if you want to get vaccinated. I have no problem with that. I really do not. But you don't get to tell people that they have to inject something into their body. That's not okay. It's just not. I don't know why that's a controversial thing to say. That's not okay. If you want to convince people that this is the right, then convince them, give them the education, give them the information that shows that this is a legitimate way to prevent against COVID, which it doesn't even do. These vaccines are complete failures. Like they don't even really, they don't prevent you from getting it. They don't prevent you from giving it. You know, it might protect you from having more severe symptoms if you do happen to come down with COVID, but that's it. So it's really a personal choice, because the only one that is being impacted by the vaccine is yourself, on how sick you get. And so that is a personal choice. And so mandating something like that is never going to be okay with me.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think the seepage of discord goes both ways now, because if you look at the example of the Toronto Star, I believe it was, which published the tweets on its front page, you can see the back and forth that's taking place there. The media propagating one way to think, and then those on social media sort of reciprocating that propagation, and then the media publishing what people on social media are saying. So it's like a cycle, a feedback loop, if you will. And again, that's what's really dangerous about this devolvement of political discourse and political communities online that we've been talking about, is that they do have very real world consequences on a much more macro scale.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very true.
Yeah.
Every lie or every war we've ever been lied into, you know, that's it is that. It's really I don't know how to get out of it. I don't know how, like you said earlier, maybe this is just going to have to be something that we learn to mitigate, because I don't think we can erase this sort of stuff from human nature. But it's overwhelming. Like, at least for me, I'm speaking like for myself, it's overwhelming how pervasive it is. And it's really just gotten so bad. I think Trump ramped it up. I think that really like set people into some camps, and they refuse to budge, which is really unfortunate. I mean, I say this all the time. There are people out there who genuinely think that anybody to the right of Bernie Sanders is a literal Nazi. And
yeah, like, good
and
luck.
there's a lot of people in there between Bernie Sanders and a literal Nazi. And it's just, I mean, you said earlier, you don't really consider yourself of the left anymore. I don't really either. Like, I hate labels anyways. I've always called myself a leftist, but like, it's such a clusterfuck of stupidity right now on the left that it's something I don't even really want to associate with. So independent, I guess, sounds good. But yeah, that we're losing ground because we refuse to have conversations with people that we don't agree with. Like, oh, we disagree on abortion, so we cannot talk about anything ever. We can't work together. Oh, you agree on Medicare for all? Too bad. We can't have, like, you can't come to my rally. You know what I mean? It's this weird, you can't sit with us mean girls vibe, where, you know, am I supposed to walk around with a questionnaire and anybody I have a conversation with, they have to fill it out. And if they're guilty of wrongthink on any one issue, then I can't talk to them. It's ridiculous. This is not a grown-up way to behave. It's just not.
Yeah.
It's really infantile. And these are grown-ass adults who proclaim to care about these things. Like my friend Magnus, who is a Boogaloo boy, held an anti-war rally, a multiple city anti-war rally, and people were pissed off. I'm like, what is wrong with you? Do you care about ending the wars or not? Because I do. And if that means I have to go march with a Boogaloo boy, I'm going to do that. You know what I mean? My ego out of it. Like, I don't care. If I want to free Assange, yes, I'll go work with people I don't agree with. If I want healthcare, yes, I'll go, you know, work with people I don't agree with. And it's really silly to me that we're isolating ourselves. I say this all the time. I think that these people want to sit smugly in their safe space and feel superior. Like, I think that they don't want to get anything done. They just want to feel like they're better than everybody else. And it's sad.
Well, that was kind of, you know, what one of the things that motivated me writing this piece as well, is I'm like, it really seems like I said, like, it's more about building a therapeutic community rather than actually trying to ignite change. Because like I can sit with, you know, people who share my exact economic and social views and then be like, yeah, like this, what's happening to Assange sucks. But like, that doesn't really do anything, because that's not going to mobilize like enough people. It's not going to build strength in numbers. And so like the question we have to ask ourselves is, why are we doing this? Like, why are we involved in political discourse? Why are we involved in political movements? Are we joining a support group? Or are we trying to, you know, affect change in society? And I think a lot of people are doing it to join a support group, which, you know, might be understandable. I met a lot of people when I was in university who came from very conservative places, and myself included, and, you know, joined like lefty groups and got catharsis out of being affirmed for maybe the first time, or like, you know, being like having people who shared a worldview and was able to, again, like make sense of the world together. And so I totally understand that. But then again, you have to be honest with yourself, like, what am I doing this for? And I think what's harmful is if you're, you know, doing a sort of support group, but you're masquerading as like a group that's trying to affect change.
Yes.
That kind of seems like one of the bigger issues that I'm seeing on the left today.
There's a lot of cosplay going on.
Yeah, and I think the endemicness of that is why there is no so-called organized left to speak of, at least in the US, but in the West in general, I would say. And just going back real quick to how polarizing bullshit like Russiagate can lead to much larger real world consequences. Look at what's happening now with the energy crisis in Europe. And instead of the European Union administrators and the British administrators trying to figure out how to solve the problem, they're focused on blaming Russia, making these false accusations that Russia is withholding the natural gas that they're supposed to be sending to Europe. Meanwhile, Germany is putting off until January the approval of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And all of this funnels back to this Russophobia, this extreme Russophobia that's been engendered in the West because of Russiagate. And it's not just Russiagate to blame, there are other factors, but Russiagate is one of the biggest ones. And so almost in real time now, we can see how this discord, this manufactured discord, is putting tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of people in jeopardy, in real jeopardy.
The Cold War and Russiagate really gave them people in, positions of power, like a ready-made scapegoat. They don't have to deal with any issue. They don't have to take any responsibility. They just blame Putin. And I just want to say that Lord Putin works in mysterious ways, Jesse. So, maybe he is responsible for this. He's responsible for literally all the bad things that have ever happened. He sank the Titanic. He is responsible for everything that's ever gone wrong. Oh, it's so frustrating. I cannot believe that in the year 2021, we're still talking about Vladimir Putin like he's some just like super powerful evil genius guy. And listen, I can't believe I have to qualify this, but I'm no fan of Vladimir Putin. Like, I know I joke about it, I'm Putin's buddy and all that stuff, but I don't like anybody in a position of power. They're all scumbags. Like, you don't reach that level of power without being kind of a scumbag. It's an impossible thing to do. Other world leaders are better than other, you know what I mean? Like, it's a varying degree. But it's just so silly to me that we're still pretending like Vladimir Putin is the cause of all of our problems. The fact that they're trying to pretend like he interfered with the 2016 election. Nobody interfered with the 2016 election more than our own two parties, the Democratic Party specifically. He could not have, dude couldn't have dreamed. Of course he tried to interfere with our election, along with probably a dozen to 20 other countries. They always do. All of these countries are always trying to interfere with each other's bullshit. That's how it works. But there's nothing, he couldn't have dreamed of doing the things that Hillary Clinton did in the 2016 primary. But nobody talks about that. I mean, we don't talk about that. We just talk about how Putin is evil. And it is to the detriment of the exclusion of all other issues. We're not tackling anything substantive that would help people in this country because we're worried about what Vladimir Putin's doing. It's so silly.
Yeah. And going back to Syria, it's the same thing with Assad.
Mm-hmm.
It's, well, what about
and Maduro, and you know what I mean? Like, it's just whoever our enemy happens to be at the time. There was a time on Twitter that I changed my name to Comrade Misty is Maduro's amiga because we were mad at Maduro for a little while. You know what I mean? Like, it's so silly. It's so silly. It's like a soap opera with psychopaths.
So, Mila, we don't want to keep you too long. So as we start to wrap here, I wanted to ask you for your take on the increasing censorship by big tech and how you think this is going to factor into what we've been talking about. We've seen a lot happen over the past week, and what sorts of effects do you think that's going to have on what we've been discussing here today?
Yeah, I find it very disturbing. I've kind of seen censorship, come in different forms, and I think that one of the ways that censorship has been happening for a while now is through these kinds of delegitimization tactics that I was talking about, like the sort of reductionism of your opponent. Because, for instance, if you share an article from a website that's not part of the sanctioned consensus, it's just automatically dismissed. I recently went on RT, and people were just kind of like, oh, but it's RT, whatever. And I'm like, okay, but do you have anything to say about what I said? Similarly, so I think that there's been a kind of censorship that has not even been that outward. It's just been I think the gray zone being censored by Wikipedia, for instance, is a good example. It's not like they eliminated them out of the internet's existence, but they delegitimized them as people who are not reliable without actually disputing anything they said factually. I think that is kind of the kind of censorship that has been worrying to me. But now we're kind of seeing stuff where it's like, okay, yeah, people are also getting banned from Twitter for life, which really does take you out of the public sphere. It kind of sounds funny, but it is a way of kind of shutting someone out of the discourse, especially in COVID, where things are becoming more and more online to begin with. To me, it kind of indicates the fact that these tech companies are becoming our new governments, our new enforcers. And, part of it's probably just a fear of liability. And so then that kind of points to me to an issue with our economic system fundamentally, because it's like, if your whole like livelihood, say like the livelihood of these tech workers, for instance, are dependent on, the boss's success, which is dependent on the chaos of the market, which is dependent on whatever ideological road we're swerving down next, that's making them have to censor certain things out of fear of liability. It just kind of reveals an entire brokenness with our economic system. So I think that, like, one way to foster free speech is to give people more assurances, economic assurances, that and especially, for instance, like one of the common ways that, not common, but something that we've been talking about a lot is people getting fired for their opinions, or what they say on Twitter. Again, that's like a labor law problem, fundamentally. And so I think, again, like free speech is going to rest upon these things. I know this is like a really massive answer, but there's a lot of factors that go into it, primarily economic in my view. And I don't know if like our economic system now is just like conducive to free speech at all. And that's so that we might need like a larger overhaul to fix it, which I don't really see in the future.
No, which is depressing, but I think that we really are screwed. I mean, again, I hate being like a negative Nancy, as AOC says, but I mean, if you just, just look at everything that's happening around you, it's very difficult to find any hope whatsoever, because, we are in this system that is kind of designed to kill all of us. They're making these grabs for more power and control every single day. And part of that is the censorship. They want to be able to control the narrative entirely. And that should terrify everybody. I mean, that's what makes the Julian Assange case so important, is because this would set the precedent that the United States now has global jurisdiction over information and journalism. And I don't think anybody with 2 brain cells should be comfortable with that fact. No empire should have that much control over the discourse and over information. That's not okay. And so, we're hurtling down this path, and nobody seems very pressed to stop it. So, it's really depressing to watch. And it's really especially depressing to watch and know what's happening and be yelling about it. Nobody gives a shit. You know what I mean?
I think a lot of people feel very powerless.
Yeah.
I think also, I think there's a misconception almost that, and it's a very understandable misconception, that, the censorship is happening to actually prevent people from accessing certain information, which I don't think is quite correct. I think it's more an assertion of power, and it's a way of disciplining people into being afraid of being a sort of thorn in the side of the powers that be. And so, for instance, it might make you not want to, like, there's a lot of things that I don't write about or don't talk about, which is hilarious because I seem like I'm just talking about so much stuff all the time, but like there's certain things I will tread carefully on. And it's not because, I don't think, like, I don't feel like I'm barred from seeking out information. There's too much info at our fingertips now to really keep people in the dark about things anymore. So everything actually seems pretty out in the open. But the way that, there's discouragement is through delegitimization, which we see in COVID, or with the gray zones, Wikipedia's stuff, like all of that. But then we also see it through like this sort of disciplinary mechanism where it's like, yeah, I know you want to criticize this, but I'm going to punish you. And so you're kind of beating people down and disincentivizing them from doing that.
Yeah, and it's, as far as narrative management goes, it seems to be a much smarter approach to leave what you want to censor in place, but put a label on it or taint it in a way, such as the way Wikipedia has tried to taint the gray zone, than to take it away wholesale. Because if you take it away wholesale, it's much more obvious to people on the outside looking in that it's censorship. Whereas if it's there and you can read it, but it comes with whatever caveat the elites decide to put on it so that their narrative stays intact, then you're much less likely, I think, to be suspicious or understand that you are being subject to censorship. It's just not as flagrant as what we're taught censorship is.
Yes. It's very covert. I mean, it really is. There's a lot of, I think it's essentially, they just want to, create an environment where self-censorship is the norm, where there's just things you won't talk about because you're afraid of being labeled by society as a conspiracy theorist or as a whatever. I mean, there's a multitude of issues that people won't talk about that are legitimate issues. I mean, like you talk about the Great Reset or the Fourth Industrial Revolution or any of those things, and you're labeled as this crazy conspiracy theorist. But it's not like Klaus Schwab hasn't written a whole ass book about it. You know what I mean? Like there's a reason to be having these discussions. But they'll label you, they'll tag you as this just crazy cuckoo birds conspiracy theorists. And I firmly believe, I'll say it again, I firmly believe that's what Pizzagate was all about. They created this ridiculous situation where this gunman goes into this pizza shop, and it's absurd. But now, if you talk about elite rings and pedophilia, then you're labeled as a conspiracy theorist. But we know that there's pedophilia rings in elite circles. We know Jeffrey Epstein exists. We know there was the other guy, I forget his name, Hastert or whatever.
He used to exist.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true. But you know what I'm saying? Like that we know that that's a thing, but now they try to make those things third rail issues to even bring up because they don't want you to talk about them. And so it's like really just engendering this self-censorship, around these things that they just don't want you talking about. And they're very good at like setting the approved narrative. And anybody that steps out of line of that is very quickly labeled and ostracized. And it's very scary. And how they're able to do this. It's very effective.
Totally.
So Mila, you end your piece talking about some potential ways out of this discord, this online political community discord we've been talking about. Can you break that down a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I don't pretend to have solutions. I would really encourage collaboration across ideology, as I always have. And instead of, jumping to conclusions, maybe not, but in the piece, I also kind of talk about how our economic uncertainty has created this problem. And so, like I said, I do think we need to sort of rethink how we economically organize ourselves. And I also think that we need to sort of find a life outside of politics, or find a way to find community that is not dependent on, feeling intellectually superior to other people. And so I do think that like there's that issue, there's this crisis in self-esteem that we need to contend with, which I think again comes from a lack of community. These are all very like broad and vague sort of solutions, but I think they have to be, because they're going to be different for different people and for different local groups or like different societies and even right. And so like the solution for where I am in Canada might even be different than it is in the US, because there are different cultural particularities. I definitely I think that that's kind of where I'm at with that. Like I said, I've been thinking a lot about the decline of religion. I don't mean that like we need to like fully revive religion, but I do think that there is a benefit to trying to live for something beyond yourself, and live for something that is not about you affirming your self-worth, but for someone else or for something greater than yourself.
Which we don't necessarily need religion for,
Yeah, of
just
course not.
community.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the community aspect is the biggest thing for me. I think, and I've actually been seeing this. I think COVID is it's kind of gone both ways. We've been isolated from each other, but I also see a lot of people participating more in mutual aid, or trying to help out in their communities or whatever. So I mean, I don't know. It seems like we're kind of in many ways, we're at this turning point in humanity's existence. And we're kind of in a weird place right now. I think the empire's falling, has been for quite some time. We're living in the death of it. And it's gonna be interesting moving forward, just how all of this stuff plays out. But I think that, trying to fix these fissures in community is a huge part of that, because I think, especially just with being online, I think that there isn't a necessity so much to have human interaction, to walk outside and just talk to your neighbor, or, and I think that we need to revive some of that more. I think that, we're social creatures. We need that.
Yeah. And I think, to your point, Mila, about the economic aspect of all of this, that's a really important context or umbrella over all of this to remember, because these social media platforms were invented first and foremost for capital, to produce capital, to preserve the capitalist system, to secure the ranks of the capitalist oligarchic ruling class. And our participation on these platforms is inherently, therefore, tainted by that. And we have to always remember that that is a huge factor in our use of these platforms, whatever we're using them for. So it's important to, I suppose, always keep, at least in the back of your mind, that capitalism is the enemy here, the biggest enemy engine here, if you will.
Yes, agreed, sir. Definitely.
All right. Well, Mila, thanks so much for joining us today. I think it was a good conversation, and I think it was important to break down this very important piece you've written for Passage, called "Political Antagonism Has Become Therapy for a Broken Society." And we'll link to it in our show notes. And we'll also link to Pro Democracy Pod, which I forgot to mention in my intro, which you co-host with Alex Rubenstein, who's a friend of the show.
Love Alex.
Very astute, very good guy. So Mila Ghorayeb, thank you so much for joining us. And do you want to tell people where they can find you and your work online?
Yeah, so I am on Twitter, just my first and last name. That's where I mostly share my stuff anyway. We're on Rockfin, at Pro Democracy Pod, at Pro Dem Pod. And yeah, that's a new show that I've started with Alex. It's been great. And my Substack is just my last name .substack.com. I don't write like terribly often there anymore, because I became a columnist at Passage, but also because I am in school and working.
Law school, no less.
Yeah, there's a lot
time consuming
there, but I'm trying to learn how to free Assange or something. So
no, we could use some more help in the legal aspect, although the law really doesn't matter in this case.
Yeah, I know, I'm kidding, but yeah,
Goodness. Yeah. And the show's great. So everybody check out the Pro Democracy Pod. Alex is a fantastic human. So, I'm always trying to boost his work for him. So I love the show. And I'm looking forward to reading more of your work. So yeah, thanks for coming on the show. We appreciate it. We'd love to have you back anytime to just shoot the shit about whatever is going on, because there's always something.
There is.
There's always something.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.